If one day you wake up and realize that you are still breathing, still capable of feeling pain, still capable of fear, yet on paper, in the bank, and in the phones of the people who love you most, you no longer exist, what would you call that? A disappearance, or a slow kind of death while the heart is still beating. Imagine that someone else is living your life. That person uses your name, spends the money you saved over an entire lifetime, signs debts in your name, texts your mother from your phone number, and tells the world that you are doing just fine. Meanwhile, where are you? No one hears your voice. No one knows that you still exist. No one is looking for you, because on record, you vanished by your own choice. This is not a story about a murder that happens in a matter of minutes. This is a story about a human being erased piece by piece. Not with a knife or a gun, but with silence, with paperwork, with a phone held in someone else's hand. Somewhere deep underground, with no light, no sense of time, and no human voices, there is a man who once had a family, a job, and dreams that were small, ordinary, and deeply human. He is chained like an object, surviving one day at a time on carefully measured drops of water. While above ground, another version of him walks freely, laughs, spends money, and slowly destroys everything he once built. The most terrifying thing is not the iron cage or the suffocating darkness of an abandoned mine. The most terrifying thing is that no one knows you are screaming for help. No one suspects a thing. No one believes that a living person could have his entire life stolen so completely. This story begins very quietly. A chance meeting. A beer at a familiar bar. An invitation to go hiking in the mountains. No obvious danger. No clear warning signs. Just a man who believed the world around him was safe enough to trust a stranger. And then, in a single moment, he disappears. Not in the way people usually disappear. He vanishes even though he is still alive. The question is not only who did this, but how a person can be erased from his own life while the entire world believes he simply walked away. This is the story of Donald Foster, and of someone who decided that another man's life was something that could be taken, used, and discarded like a lifeless piece of property. Donald Foster was born and raised in a small town in the state of North Carolina, a place where people recognize one another by a glance and a nod every morning. There was nothing remarkable about Donald's life, nothing that seemed worth remembering. And it is precisely that ordinariness that makes his story more painful than almost anything else. At the age of 21, Donald was the kind of person you would trust with your house keys without hesitation. He worked as a delivery driver for a local company, waking up at the same time every morning, driving an old car along familiar roads, carrying packages in an attitude that was always punctual. He did not dream of getting rich quickly, and he did not believe in sudden luck. Donald believed in work, in stability, in saving one small dollar at a time to build a future. Friends later recalled that Donald was quiet, but once he gave his word, he followed through no matter what. He did not like showing off. He did not want to be the center of any conversation. Donald was content with simple things. Dinner with his family. A free afternoon spent fixing his car. A short walk in the woods to breathe clean air and clear his head. Donald's dreams were modest as well. He wanted to open his own service shop. Not a large chain. Not a famous brand. Just a place where he could be his own boss, enough to make his parents proud, enough that one day he could build a family on the very land where he grew up. Donald saved carefully for that dream, turning down expensive nights out, choosing safety over adventure. Family mattered more to Donald than anything else. He called his parents often and informed them in advance of even the smallest plans. He was not impulsive, and he was certainly not the kind of person who would disappear without a word. To Donald, life was something that needed to be organized clearly, step by step, leaving no loose ends behind. That is why, when Donald walked out of the Rusty Anchor Bar on an early spring evening in the year 2018, No one, including Donald himself, could have imagined that it was the final moment of an ordinary life. No one knew that all of those simple things, his job, his dreams, his dignity, and even his very existence, had entered the sights of someone who viewed human beings as nothing more than tools. Donald Foster was not looking for trouble. He was simply a young man who believed the world was kind enough that a casual conversation could not destroy an entire life. And that gentle belief became a fatal weakness in a story where evil did not need to scream. It only needed to wait patiently. James West entered Donald Foster's life in a way that made it almost impossible to feel alarmed. He did not appear as a frightening stranger, nor as the kind of person who triggers suspicion at first glance. On the contrary, James walked into the rusty Anchor Bar as if he had belonged there for years. James was around 23 years old, dressed simply but not carelessly. He spoke with ease, smiled just enough, knew how to listen, and asked questions that made people feel seen and respected. In a room filled with laborers worn down after long shifts, James felt like a different kind of presence. Unhurried, uncomplaining, never telling stories of hardship. What caught many people's attention was that James always seemed to have cash. He readily bought beers, paid for new acquaintances, as if money had never been a concern. When asked what he did for a living, James would smile and give a vague answer, saying he did a bit of everything, drifting from place to place, as long as it paid enough to get by. The response sounded carefree, yet it lacked the details people usually share without even realizing it. No one knew where James lived. No one had ever been invited to his home. He did not talk about family, and he never spoke of his past. The stories James told were often captivating, but they always stopped at just the right moment, as if there were an invisible line he never crossed. To most people, it seemed like privacy. To those more perceptive, it felt like an absence that was hard to define. James showed a particular fascination with nature and long-distance hiking. He spoke about forests and mountains with the confidence of someone deeply familiar with them, mentioning trails, remote areas, and places that never appear on tourist maps. When he talked, his eyes lit up, not with the excitement of someone who loves scenery, but with the recognition of someone who had spent a great deal of time there. To Donald Foster, James West was the complete opposite of his carefully planned life. James lived freely, unbound, untouched by responsibility or expectation. And it was that freedom that Donald found himself admiring. Not because he wanted to become James, but because he believed that someone who lived that way must be genuinely honest to survive in the world. What Donald did not realize, and what no one in that bar realized, was that James West was like a shadow. He appeared in the right place at the right time, said exactly what others wanted to hear, and then drifted on without leaving a trace. A man with no roots, no past, no one waiting for him, and no one who truly knew him. And sometimes, it is precisely those with nothing to lose who are most willing to take everything from someone else, using nothing more than a friendly smile and an invitation that seems harmless. Underscore 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 underscore. The morning of May 15th, 2018 began like countless other mornings in the Appalachian Mountains. The air was cool and clean, the sky clear, and the winding roads leading into the forest were quiet, as if they had never witnessed anything cruel. Donald Foster woke up with a rare sense of lightness. It was meant to be nothing more than a short hiking trip, a few days away from his familiar routine, returning before the weekend ended so he could make it back in time for his Monday morning shift. James West arrived to pick Donald up in Donald's dark blue SUV. The two of them chatted casually along the drive, about the weather, about lesser-known trails, about the feeling of leaving town behind. There was no tension. No sense that anything was wrong. Just two young men who believed they were doing something completely harmless. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, the vehicle turned into a small gas station along the road leading toward Grandfather Mountain. The station's security camera captured the final images that still resembled an ordinary life. Donald stepped out of the car, holding the fuel pump with a motion he had performed countless times before. James walked into the convenience store, his arms filled with snacks and bottled water. They were not in a hurry, not uneasy, unaware that every passing second was being preserved as silent evidence of Donald Foster's last moments of freedom. In the grainy footage, they laughed lightly, no different from the hundreds of people who stopped at that same gas station every day. After paying, James stepped back outside and placed the bags in the rear of the vehicle. Donald closed the gas cap and returned to the driver's seat. The SUV slowly pulled away, disappearing behind a curve that led deeper into the mountains. No one present at that moment knew they were witnessing the end of an ordinary life. From the instant the vehicle vanished from the camera's view, Donald Foster never appeared on any camera again. There were no more images. No witnesses. No trace. Only the mountains and forest stretching ahead, dense and silent. For Donald, the trip was nothing more than a brief break. He had not locked his life away or given his family any unusual instructions. He believed he would return on time, on schedule, exactly as planned, just as he had lived for 21 years. But sometimes, a single small decision, a trip that seems entirely harmless, is enough to divide a life in two. Before that moment, Donald was a free man, with a name, a family, and a future. After that moment, he became someone the world believed had chosen to disappear. And the most heartbreaking part is that throughout the drive deeper into the mountains that day, Donald still believed he was heading toward nature. He had no idea he was walking straight into a trap that had been prepared long in advance, a place where freedom was the last thing he was about to lose. 3 days passed from the morning the dark blue SUV turned toward the mountains. For Donald Foster, that was the planned length of the trip. For his family, it was the familiar point at which they expected a call saying he had made it home safely. But on the evening of May 18th, the Foster family's small house remained unsettlingly silent. Donald did not return. The phone did not ring. There was no message saying he would be late, no apology for a change of plans. That silence felt wrong, completely unlike the careful, responsible person they had raised for more than 20 years. Then the phone vibrated. A short message arrived, sent from Donald's own number. The content was brief, but it was enough to make his mother's heart skip a beat. Donald wrote that he was tired of everything, that he wanted to go to another state for a while, and that his family should not worry about him. There was no familiar greeting. No explanation. No concrete plan. That was not how Donald communicated. His mother read the message over and over, trying to convince herself that her son simply needed some space. But a mother's intuition is not easily deceived. She felt that something was deeply wrong, even if she could not put it into words. The family contacted local police immediately. They brought everything they knew about the trip, about the companion named James West, about the fact that Donald had never shown any intention of leaving his job or his family behind. The response they received was cold and procedural. Police checked the records and confirmed that the message had indeed been sent from Donald's phone, with the signal traced to an area near the trail where he had planned to hike. There were no signs of violence. No abandoned vehicle. No witnesses. On paper, Donald Foster was an adult with the right to disappear if he chose to. The case was quickly classified as a voluntary disappearance. A phrase that sounds neat, reasonable, and quietly cruel. It meant there would be no large-scale search, no helicopters, no tracking dogs. Just a few symbolic checks around the trail parking area, and then everything stopped. The Foster family was left suspended between hope and despair, They were not allowed to believe that Donald was in danger, because officially, he had chosen to leave. But they also could not believe that their son would vanish in such a cold and final way. Each day that passed, Donald's mother continued to text her son. Short messages asking how he was, familiar reminders sent into empty space. Sometimes, replies came back. Still from Donald's number. Still written in a distant, unfamiliar tone. Brief. Emotionless. As if someone were trying to play the role of a son they did not truly understand. While the family slowly wore down from waiting, the system continued to treat Donald Foster as a name that had voluntarily stepped out of his own life. No one knew that somewhere deep underground, a living person was being stripped of his voice, while above ground, a single short message was enough to make the entire world turn away from him. And it was at that moment that the true tragedy began. Not in the depths of the forest, but in the cold indifference of procedures designed to protect people, yet powerless to save someone who was screaming for help in silence. Nearly a month had passed since Donald Foster vanished, and with each morning that brought no news, his family's hope grew thinner. The Appalachian Mountains still stood where they always had, green and peaceful, as if they had never swallowed a human being whole. Yet it was that very silence that concealed something monstrous, hidden deep beneath the cold earth. On the afternoon of June 16, 2018, the weather in the area suddenly turned. Heavy clouds sank low against the mountainsides, and rain began to pour down hard, relentless and unforgiving. 3 local teenagers who had been wandering near the old Elko mine, a site abandoned for many years, were forced to look for shelter. The area was considered dangerous. Rusted warning signs stood half forgotten, fences lay collapsed, and no one officially monitored the site anymore. As they picked their way through piles of loose rock and corroded metal, one of the boys noticed something strange. Beneath a layer of rotting leaves and soaked mud lay a heavy metal hatch, almost completely consumed by time. At first, it looked like a lifeless part of an old ventilation system. But when they strained together and pushed the hatch aside, a thick, damp rush of air surged upward from underground, carrying a stench that was difficult to describe. The smell of stagnant water, of rusted metal, of a human being who had not bathed in a very long time. Then came a sound. A dry, hollow clank of metal, faint but unmistakable, as if something were moving deep in the darkness below. It was not the wind. It did not sound like an animal. One of the boys later said a chill ran straight down his spine, as if someone were knocking from beneath the earth. Using the flashlights on their phones, they shined the light downward and saw a square concrete shaft, roughly 13 feet deep. An old iron ladder was bolted to the wall, leading down into a small utility room that had been forgotten for decades. When they climbed down one by one, what they saw left all 3 of them frozen in place. In the center of the bare concrete room stood a crude iron cage, welded together from thick steel bars. Inside that cage was a human being. Donald Foster. Or rather, what remained of him. Donald lay curled up on a filthy, damp mattress. His body was shockingly thin, his cheekbones jutting sharply, his grayish skin stretched tight over bone. The clothes that had once been hiking gear were now little more than torn rags. His eyes were wide open, panicked and hollow, as though they had not seen light in a very long time. A heavy chain was locked around Donald's left ankle, the other end secured to the floor of the cage with an industrial padlock. Every movement he made produced a dry clank of metal, the same sound that had drawn strangers to him. Donald barely reacted to the sound of human voices. He raised his hands to cover his face, murmuring incoherent sounds, as if he could not believe these were real people and not hallucinations born of despair. Outside the cage, supplies were arranged with chilling precision. Large plastic water containers, most of them nearly empty. A crate of military-style ration packs, just enough to keep a body alive, but nothing more. Everything had been calculated carefully, enough for a man not to die, but never enough for him to live like a human being. When rescue workers and police arrived, they quickly grasped the horror of what they were seeing. The room lay deep underground, its thick concrete walls absorbing all sound. No matter how many times Donald might have screamed, the world above would have heard nothing at all. If the rain had not fallen that afternoon, if the three teenagers had not wandered into the mine, Donald Foster might have disappeared forever, not because he died, but because he was imprisoned until life itself slowly drained away in the darkness. And it was then that everyone finally understood this was not a missing person case. This was a prison built for one purpose only: to erase a human being, day by day, piece by piece, in absolute silence. When he was finally brought back up to the surface and light touched his eyes for the first time after weeks of darkness, Donald Foster was not truly free yet. Because during nearly a month underground, it was not only his body that had been imprisoned, but his will and his sense that he was still a human being. The first days inside the concrete room were a living hell. Donald screamed until his voice was raw, pounding with all his strength against the iron bars, hoping someone above ground might hear him. But the only response was a silence so thick it felt suffocating. No human voices. No engines. Nothing but the sound of water dripping from the ceiling onto the cold, damp cement floor, steady and indifferent. Very quickly, Donald realized that time no longer existed in days or nights. There was no sunlight. No clock. Only a faint glow filtering through a ventilation opening high above, so dim he had to strain his eyes just to notice any change at all. Time began to dissolve in his mind. One day felt exactly like the next. Any sense of the present or the future slowly disappeared. James West appeared roughly once a week. Without warning. Without a word. Donald only knew he was there when footsteps echoed down the iron ladder. West always wore thick gloves and kept his face covered, using only a headlamp to light the ground. That beam never shone directly on Donald's face, as if he deliberately avoided looking at a living person. He placed the water bottles and food rations on the ground, then slid them through a narrow gap beneath the cage. No explanations. No answers. To West, Donald was not someone to speak to. He was simply a living organism that needed to be kept at the bare minimum. The punishment did not come through beatings, but through thirst. Donald later said that whenever he tried to beg, to ask why, or to scream in desperation, the next visit would not come. 3 days. Then 5 days. Once, 10 days without a single drop of water. The thirst made his throat feel like it was on fire. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. Every breath was painful. After being left without water for 3 full days, Donald understood something brutally clear. Resistance did not bring freedom. It only brought longer suffering. From that point on, he became silent. He ate when food was given. He drank when water was given. He curled into a corner of the cage, focusing only on surviving one more day. The cruelest part was not the hunger or the thirst, but the feeling of being erased from the world. Donald did not know where his family was. He did not know if anyone was searching for him. He did not know whether he was still considered a living person at all. In the darkness, a terrifying thought slowly took shape. Perhaps above ground, everyone believed he had chosen to disappear. Perhaps his life had already been completely replaced. Inside that prison, James West never needed to speak a single threat. Silence itself was the weapon. It wore Donald down piece by piece, until he no longer thought about escaping, but only prayed for one more chance to see the sky, even if it lasted just a few seconds. Life inside the iron cage did not merely confine Donald Foster's body. It transformed him into someone who lived in constant fear, constant waiting, slowly growing accustomed to the idea that his very existence depended entirely on the cold indifference of a man who had never seen him as human. while the real Donald Foster sat curled up inside an iron cage beneath the ground, where each drop of water became a luxury needed to cling to life. Another Donald Foster continued to exist above the surface. No one saw a difference. No one asked questions. The entire world believed that Donald was still living his own life. In the darkness of the abandoned mine, the real Donald began to lose his sense of self. There was no mirror, no light. No one spoke his name. The name Donald Foster slowly became unfamiliar even inside his own thoughts. At times, he wondered whether he was still Donald at all, or just a body in chains, existing only to endure. At the same time, in cities hundreds of miles away, bank cards bearing the name Donald Foster were being used again and again. Money was withdrawn in moderate amounts, careful enough not to raise suspicion. The transactions took place in crowded shopping centers and brightly lit ATMs, places where no one remembered the face of the person standing in front of the machine. The false Donald ate, traveled, rented rooms, bought things, lived a busy life. In the banking system, Donald Foster appeared as a customer spending more than usual. On paper, he had not vanished. He had simply changed his habits. Meanwhile, the real Donald knew nothing about what was happening to his own life. He did not know that the money he had carefully saved for his modest dream was being spent without hesitation. He did not know that loans were being taken out in his name, step by step dragging his life toward ruin even while he was still alive. Each time James West appeared in the concrete room, bringing water and food, Donald did not see only the man who imprisoned him. He felt, with growing clarity, that somewhere above ground, parts of his life were being taken piece by piece. Not through violence, but through cold actions on his own phone, through buttons he could not stop anyone from pressing. The most brutal aspect of these parallel worlds was the absolute injustice of it. The real Donald paid for each day of existence with physical suffering. The false Donald calmly used that identity to live, to take, to destroy. One man was trapped in darkness. The other walked freely in daylight. Donald's family continued to receive brief messages, still from the familiar phone number, still reassuring them that he was fine, that he needed time. Each message was like an invisible blade, cutting away another chance of finding him. The more evidence there seemed to be that Donald was living normally, the deeper the real Donald's silent cries were buried. In the darkness, Donald began to understand a cold truth. The man who imprisoned him did not only want him alive. He needed him to exist as a key to money, to records, to trust within his family and the system. Donald was no longer a human being in that man's eyes. He was an identity being exploited. The two worlds existed side by side, never touching. One world drowned in darkness, where a human being was slowly disappearing in silence. The other was filled with artificial light, where his identity continued to walk, talk, spend money, and leave behind a life being destroyed day by day. And the most painful truth of all was this: if not for a very small mistake that would come later, those two worlds might never have collided again. Throughout the weeks following Donald Foster's disappearance, his mother continued to do the only thing she could. She texted her son every single day. Not to interrogate him, not to pressure him. Just short, familiar messages, asking whether he was eating properly, whether he was sleeping well, whether he missed home. Sometimes, replies came back. Brief messages. Cold. Logically sound. Donald said he was in the woods, that he needed more time to think, that he wanted to be alone. Everything sounded reasonable. Nothing was overtly wrong. But there was one detail that did not fit, something so small that if she had not been Donald's mother, she might never have noticed it. In one message sent toward the end of May, the person behind the phone used a word that seemed, on the surface, very affectionate. Mommy. Just that one word. And yet, to his mother, it felt like an alarm ringing deep inside her chest. She read the message again and again, her heart pounding, her hands beginning to shake. In 21 years of being his mother, she had never heard Donald call her that. Not in texts. Not in short phone calls. Donald always called her Mom. Simple. Direct. In keeping with his quiet, emotionally reserved nature. Mommy was not how Donald spoke. It did not belong to her son. In that moment, every attempt at self-reassurance collapsed. His mother knew, with sudden clarity, that the person on the other end was not her child. Someone else was trying to hear Donald's voice, but did not understand the smallest details of a mother and son's relationship. And it was that tiny detail that betrayed him. She began rereading every previous message, line by line, pause by pause. Everything appeared correct, yet something essential was missing. The genuine warmth. The familiar awkwardness of her son's wording. The small, practical reminders Donald usually included without thinking. Each message felt increasingly like a replica designed to deceive, not to connect. The Foster family returned to the police station, this time not with vague fear, but with certainty. They said someone was impersonating Donald. That their son was in danger. That the messages were no longer proof of a voluntary disappearance, but signs of a crime unfolding in real time. At first, skepticism was still visible on the investigators' faces. But a mother's intuition, something no machine or file can measure, opened a new path forward. From the moment a single wrong word was sent, the kidnapper's perfect script began to crack. In a world ruled by data and procedure, it was a mother's love that accomplished what the system could not. It asked the right question at the right moment. And from that question, the truth finally began to find its way out of the darkness. After that small but decisive detail, the case was finally seen through a different lens. No longer as an adult who had voluntarily disappeared, but as the very real possibility of a carefully staged scenario. And as the truth began to surface, it did not emerge from anything dramatic or grand, but from dry numbers and receipts that seemed meaningless at first glance. Under sustained pressure from the Foster family, police eventually obtained authorization to access Donald's financial records. Bank statements were printed and spread across investigators' desks. At first, the transactions appeared ordinary. Withdrawals were not excessive. They were not clustered too closely together. Everything had been calculated to resemble the spending of someone traveling, someone allowing himself a bit more freedom. But when those transactions were mapped by time and location, a different picture began to form. Money was withdrawn in cities far from where Donald lived. Asheville, Charlotte, places Donald rarely visited. His spending habits had changed completely, no longer resembling those of a young man who saved every dollar for a modest dream. Then there was one transaction that made investigators stop and stare. A large construction supply store in the town of Morgan. The receipt listed items that could not be ignored. Cement. Industrial bolts. A new padlock. High-strength chains. And several crates of military-style food rations. These were not items someone bought for a hiking trip. They were not the belongings of someone preparing to move to another state for work. The receipt read like a list of materials meant to build something permanent. Heavy, reinforced, and not intended for free human life. One investigator later said that in that moment, they understood something had been prepared in advance. A space not meant for ordinary living. A place solid enough to confine someone. Security camera footage from the store was pulled. The images were grainy, but they were enough to silence the room. A man wearing a hooded jacket, the hood pulled low, stood at the self-checkout. He used a card bearing the name Donald Foster, calmly scanning each heavy item. No hurry. No visible anxiety. as if he were buying supplies for a task he knew well. When the footage was enlarged, small details began to speak. His posture, his height, the way he leaned forward when lifting the bags of cement. Everything matched descriptions of James West, the companion who had gone into the mountains with Donald and never come back out. What chilled investigators was not only the match, but the timing. The receipt was paid just days after Donald disappeared, meaning that while the real Donald was already imprisoned beneath the ground, another man was using his money to finish building the place that held him. From that moment on, the scattered pieces began to lock together. The fake messages, the financial transactions, the concrete prison beneath the abandoned mine. This was no impulsive act. It was a plan carried out with preparation, cold intent, and patience. The backward tracing investigation had begun. And every receipt, every frame of camera footage, became more than legal evidence. There were silent accusations against a man who believed he could steal a human life and vanish without leaving a trace. The manhunt that had stretched on for weeks finally led investigators to a fragile point on the map. A small motel sitting right along the border between North Carolina and Tennessee, where winding mountain roads made it possible for someone to disappear within hours. It was the kind of place where no one asked who you were, where you came from, or when you left. And no one remembered you afterward. That night, the air inside the motel felt unnaturally still. A narrow hallway, dim yellow lights casting a dull glow onto worn carpet. No unnecessary sound. The officers moved slowly, each step heavy, as if they could sense the cold waiting behind the door ahead. When the door swung open, James West was sitting in front of a laptop. The blue light from the screen washed over his face, come in a way that was deeply unsettling. No panic. No sudden movement. No attempt to run. West simply looked up, met the gaze of the officers pointing their weapons at him, and slowly placed both hands on the table. The moment did not feel like an arrest. It felt like a meeting that had been expected for a long time. James West offered no resistance, no reaction, as if he had already calculated that this moment would eventually arrive. One officer later said that what sent a chill through the room was not the silence, but West's eyes. No fear. No remorse. Only a cold curiosity, as though he were quietly evaluating how quickly his own plan had failed. As he was placed in handcuffs, West asked just one question, his voice flat, emotionless. "You found me sooner than I expected. I thought I had at least 2 more days." It was not a plea, not defiance. It sounded like the disappointment of someone who had miscalculated a number. Inside the motel room, police recovered evidence that could not be denied. Donald Foster's wallet, his bank cards, his identification, the laptop still logged into online accounts under Donald's name. Everything was neatly arranged, as if this were merely a temporary office for unfinished work. There were no shouts, no drama. The arrest unfolded cold and hollow, mirroring the way James West had treated his victim. To him, everything was a process. And when that process ended, he accepted it as an inevitable outcome. Outside, mountain wind swept across the empty parking lot. Somewhere else, Donald Foster lay in a hospital bed, breathing free air for the first time in weeks. 2 men who had once walked into the forest together now existed in completely different worlds. And in that border motel, a perfect plan built on silence, calculation, and indifference finally collapsed, not with gunfire, but with the soft metallic sound of handcuffs locking around the wrists of a man who believed he could steal a life and walk away unseen. The name James West collapsed almost immediately once investigators began digging deeper into the data he had left behind. Records were opened. Systems were cross-checked. And in a very short time, it became clear that the man sitting silently in the interrogation room had never truly existed. James West was only a borrowed name, a mask worn just long enough to deceive everyone around him. The man behind it all had a different name: Robert Lang. Robert Lang was not unfamiliar to law enforcement. He was a ghost who had drifted through multiple states for nearly 10 years. No fixed address, no stable job, no lasting relationships. Lang survived by slipping into other people's lives, using them until they were no longer useful, and then disappearing as if he had never been there. He was particularly skilled at choosing his targets. Young people, gentle, employed, loved by their families, with bank accounts sufficient to support his life for a period of time. To Lang, they were not human beings. They were resources, identities to be exploited. During interrogations, Robert Lang showed no signs of anxiety. He sat upright, answered questions briefly and precisely, as if he were explaining a failed business venture. When asked about Donald Foster, he did not use the word victim. He referred to Donald as an asset. Lang said Donald lived too safely, saved too much, wasted the potential of a good identity. In his twisted reasoning, taking over Donald's life was not a crime, but an optimization. He believed he was simply making efficient use of something that already existed. What unsettled investigators most was not the confession itself, but the complete calm in Lang's voice. Not a trace of remorse. Not a moment of hesitation. He spoke about calculating water rations, food portions, and the number of days he withheld visits as punishment, as if he were describing routine maintenance on a machine. To Robert Lang, imprisoning Donald in an iron cage was not cruelty. It was preservation. A way to keep the identity from degrading. He needed Donald alive. Not healthy. Not happy. Just breathing. Once the James West mask fell away, every earlier detail suddenly made sense. The mystery. The half-finished stories. The knowledge of abandoned mines. The metalworking skills. The careful financial transactions. All of it belonged to a man who had lived in the shadows for so long that stealing another person's life felt normal to him. Robert Lang did not merely kidnap a human being. He attempted to take ownership of Donald Foster's existence itself. And sitting across from him, investigators were left with a chilling realization. The most dangerous evil is not sudden violence, but a person who can strip another human being of everything with absolute calm, fully convinced that he has done nothing wrong. The courtroom was packed on the morning the trial began. The air was so heavy that even a quiet cough made people flinch. Donald Foster's family sat in the back row, their shoulders pressed close together, as if reminding themselves that they were still standing in the same reality, after everything that had happened. Donald entered slowly, his steps still unsteady. His body had been saved, but his eyes carried the shadow of the long days spent beneath the ground. When he took his seat, he did not look toward the defendant. Not out of hatred, but because the fear was still intact. To Donald, that man was not just a criminal. He was a living memory of powerlessness. Robert Lang was led into the courtroom wearing a plain prison uniform. He did not lower his head. He did not scan the room. He showed no visible tension. His face was calm to the point of coldness, as if this were nothing more than an administrative procedure he was required to attend. As the prosecutor read the lengthy list of serious charges, Lang sat motionless, hands folded, eyes empty. One by one, the evidence was presented. Security footage from the construction supply store. Bank statements. Photographs of the concrete room beneath the abandoned mine. The iron cage. The chain. The industrial padlock. Each detail was another slow cut into those listening. When it was Donald's turn to testify, the courtroom fell completely silent. His voice trembled, breaking at times, but every word was clear. He did not speak for revenge. He spoke to confirm how he had once been erased from the world. People in the room lowered their heads. His mother could not hold back her tears. His father clenched his fists so tightly that his nails pressed into his skin. Throughout it all, Robert Lang showed no reaction. He did not look at Donald. He did not avert his eyes. He did not attempt to explain himself. His silence was not remorse. It was absolute indifference. As if everything being described were nothing more than data that had nothing to do with him. When the judge delivered the sentence, the steady voice echoed through the room. 30 years in prison. No possibility of parole for the first 25 years. The words landed with weight, but they produced no change on Lang's face. He simply stood there, listening, like someone receiving the final result of a calculation already completed. As he was led out of the courtroom, Robert Lang turned his head briefly. He did not look at Donald. He did not look at the victim's family. He stared into an undefined space ahead, a place where there were no identities left to steal, no lives left to take. Justice had been spoken, but everyone in that room understood that the sentence could never give Donald Foster back what had been taken from him. It only closed one chapter of a crime, leaving behind the heavy silence of a man who had never truly seen other human beings as human at all. After the trial ended, the media lights slowly faded. The name Robert Lang became just another file stored away. But for Donald Foster, the story did not end there. In truth, it was only beginning, in a silence far longer and far more painful. Donald left the hospital with his body partially healed, but his mind still trapped beneath the ground. Nightmares came with relentless regularity. In his sleep, he heard metal striking metal, water dripping, footsteps echoing down an iron staircase. He woke in panic, his heart racing, cold sweat soaking through his shirt, needing several minutes to realize that he was above ground again. Things that once felt ordinary had become trials. Fluorescent lights in grocery stores made him dizzy. Enclosed rooms left him gasping for air. The sound of a door locking behind him was enough to freeze his body in place. Donald could no longer work as a delivery driver. Unfamiliar roads, unknown houses, all of it brought back the feeling of being taken somewhere with no way out. Doctors called it post-traumatic stress. But to Donald, it felt like having his right to be a normal human being stolen. He no longer trusted chance encounters. No longer believed that a friendly smile was harmless. Every stranger who passed by could be a trap, another mask hiding danger. The damage was not only psychological. The debts taken out in his name were still there. His credit record was ruined. The dream of opening a small shop, the dream he had carried carefully for years, now felt farther away than ever. Donald survived, but the future he had spent his youth building was no longer intact. His family stayed close, trying to make up for everything with love and patience. But some pain cannot be fully shared. Some memories Donald kept to himself, because he knew no one could truly understand what it meant to be erased from the world while still alive. In a rare conversation with a therapist, Donald said that the most painful part was not the iron cage. It was the feeling of being replaced. Someone else had lived his life better than he had, more freely than he ever could, while he was imprisoned. And even though justice had been served, that sense of theft did not disappear easily. Donald Foster returned home. But the person who came back from the abandoned mine was no longer the 21-year-old who believed completely in the kindness of the world. He lives on, one day at a time, learning how to breathe in the light again, learning how to trust people once more, even as every step carries the echo of darkness. He survived. But his old life, that ordinary and stable life, was left behind forever beneath the cold ground, alongside the iron cage that will never be spoken of again, yet will never truly disappear from his memory. Donald Foster's story does not end with death, but with something even more unsettling. A man can survive, and yet his life may never be fully returned to him. And this did not happen because the world was too strange, but because it was too familiar. In modern society, we carry our entire lives in our pockets. A small phone holds our name, our bank accounts, our movements, our relationships, and the trust of the people who love us. It is the key that opens every door. But in someone else's hands, it can also become the sharpest weapon of all. Donald was not stolen only with chains and concrete. He was stolen with reassuring text messages, with legitimate transactions, with a system that believed that if the phone was still active, then the person behind it must be fine. His existence was denied not through visible violence, but through procedures that followed every rule correctly. This story is not just a criminal case. It is a warning to all of us. Evil does not always arrive with a frightening face. Sometimes it sits next to you in a bar, speaks just warmly enough, listens just closely enough, and quietly learns how to become you. In a world where identities can be copied, where people are validated by numbers and devices, trust has become more fragile than ever. A single misplaced word, one unfamiliar phrase, can sometimes be the last thread connecting a person who is silently screaming for help to the outside world. Donald Foster survived because of his family's persistence, because of a mother's intuition, and because of one very small mistake in what seemed like a perfect script. But not everyone is that fortunate. Somewhere out there, people can still be erased from their own lives simply because the world trusts data more than it trusts human instinct. The story ends here, but its echo does not. It reminds us that in the digital age, protecting ourselves is not only about locking our doors, but about guarding our identities. Not only about being cautious with strangers, but about paying attention to what feels wrong, no matter how small it seems. Because sometimes, the line between an ordinary life and a nightmare is not hidden deep in the wilderness. Sometimes, it lies in the glow of a phone lighting up in your hand, in a moment when you believe everything is still safe.